Hold on a sec. That's always the bit that's hopeful. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the June edition of SM Advanced Forum. My name's Dom Robinson, one of your usual and regular hosts, and we'll be bringing in some lovely guests with lots of expertise from the sector very shortly. Now, as you know, SMAP's a very informal thing, so we're never very structured about what we're going to talk about. And if you have something to add, do get down the chat room. Oh, I forgot to press one of the buttons, but doesn't matter. Everyone's jumping. Come excuse the background noise here. And the flashing lights my end of the system, but that's what we're here for. And as always, I'm joined by my two studio guests. I have Tim and Mark. Tim, are you out there?
I am here, Dom. I'm not a studio guest. I'm actually a co-host with you.
You're okay. There you go. That was what happens. I looked at the website and it was flashing at me in the most incomprehensible way, and I started to debug that in my head and lost my train of thought. But how have you been? How have you been? We've seen a lot of each other this month. But
yeah, I was going to say we've both been fairly occupied with doing a whole bunch of content, both around Streaming Media East Connect and Content Delivery Summit, and I would love to talk about greening of streaming at some point here today, but let's not do that right at the moment. We'll pass over to Mark.
Well, hello there. I would like to talk about the greening of streaming as well, because I'm not exactly sure what that term refers to. So we'll get there, but things are good on my end. Just working on a lot of events all of a sudden. Everyone woke up and got a budget for live streaming. So we're back to doing some of the stuff that I've been waiting 14, 15 months for us to get back to doing. And then on top of that, we've got, the remote virtual hybrid events that we've been doing for the past year or so. So things are busy right now, but that's a good problem to have.
Do you think did they actually get the budget to do the webcast, or did they get the budget to do the events that you can webcast? Is that what's changed? Because I think there's been quite a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, that's really the thing.
Last year.
Is that sports and entertainment are starting to come back finally, and that requires some on-site production typically. So it's still in a weird gray area. We're doing some Remy style production for some sporting events coming up and that sort of thing. So it's going to be interesting for a while. It's going to be a lot of reinventing the wheel for a little bit, and then we'll all settle into to a groove. And I think it'll be a little bit of the traditional stuff that we've done in the past, and quite a bit of new workflows, as it were.
Perfect. Mark DJ's just joined us in the chat as well and says hi to everyone. Good. Nice to know we're getting out there. Cool. So Tim, do you want to take us to meet our guests briefly? Because I'm burning to talk about greening of streaming, and I think I'd rather talk about that with the guests as well, because I think they're great guests and they probably have something to say.
So we'll start with Liberty. Liberty, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of where you've been in the industry. And you're on mute. So.
Yes, that's what we've been doing for the past year. You're on mute. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Liberty White. I'm the CEO of Chosen Media, video marketing agency. We've been in this space for the last 15, 20 years with media experience. We do video marketing, and that would be live streaming, creating social video content. So much like Mark said, just the uptick in people needing virtual, but then also hybrid. I'm excited to dig into that even more a little bit later.
Excellent. Thanks, Liberty. And then Scott, as we understand when we talked before, both of our guests today are Canadian, so we feel like it's an international conversation, although they both live in the U.S. You tell us a little bit about yourself. And, besides having lived where only moose, rocks, and trees exist, what do you do in the industry itself?
So, I'm Scott Davis. I'm a I'm a video broadcast engineer, an old school one, but of all things, I work for a cloud compute company. I work with Microsoft. Just coming out of the cable industry where I've been for the last decade and a half, working on broadcast and media inside the cloud world, trying to figure out where do we go from here and what are the cool and interesting things we can do for broadcast media customers as they migrate from on-prem to the cloud world. It's an interesting time of change. We talked about the greening compute. There's a lot of interest in that. Also, you talked about production a few minutes ago, Mark. A lot of interest in REMI, trying to figure out how do we go from a world where we've all been locked inside our houses, and for example, some of us are locked in our basement here in Denver, Colorado, and been here for a year. How do we help people do what they've done so well for a decade, do it from wherever they are in the world?
Interesting. And you said traditional engineer, so like class 1 type broadcast stuff back in the day?
Lines of resolution, video resolution, been working on HDR and 4K shoots, although I'm going to argue that 4K is old school. It's time for us to do 8K now.
Well, the reason I asked that is it's fascinating teaching students, as an adjunct, you try to talk about 1 volt peak to peak versus, bits and packets, and how those two things merge together. So it's nice to know we've got somebody on here who's lived in both of those worlds.
It's funny you should mention that. I was trying to explain to somebody why frame rates are at 29.97 the other day versus being an integer frame rate, and because why it's there, and because why we need to add a little bit of space for color burst. And there's a great video online from the guy who does stand-up math, does a great expression of why we had to give up a little bit of space, and it's all because of you can't do analog in anything but integer, but you can do frame rates in segments.
Yeah. Well, and of course, us in the States here with drop frame versus non-drop frame, Dom's sort of chuckling because over there's no problem.
25, mate.
Hey,
25.
their math worked out.
And half that's 12 somehow. Half that's 12 somehow. I don't know, but end up.
Anyway,
yes,
good.
but it's so flickery over there, Dom.
We haven't got the eyes for it, dude.
Right.
The vision.
Very dark here most of the year, so we can't see that well.
So Dom, I'm going to hand it back to you to sort of kick off the greening of streaming piece, because we had some really good success during CDS having conversations around this.
And I'm going to ask Mark to keep Tim and I tame on this subject, because I can see it starting to become dominant in SMAF. But basically, we've been introducing a theme in the Content Delivery Summit. Excuse me, looking left for a second, just quitting Discord so it doesn't beep in everyone's ears. We've introduced a theme of sustainability into the Content Delivery Summit, because when I took over the programming, I realized that none of the CDNs, none of the deep architects, none of the infra guys owned the problem. We all understood it, but the problem was always owned by the CFO or the COO or somebody buying the electricity or somebody downstream. And there's been a few interesting bits of media produced that have highlighted quite how much electricity is being used by telecom services, internet services, and more recently it's become hip to point the finger at how much energy is being used to provide streaming. So last spring, Tim and I sort of co-authored a couple of articles and started using this term greening of streaming to look at some of the data, and knowing what we actually know about the real world of the infrastructure, try to make some conjecture about the amount of electricity that's being used. And off the back of a fag packet, we came up with a unit, we started measuring it in nuclear power stations. If you cludge together, because all the other figures were kind of broadly arguing with each other anyway, we sort of took a middle line through the figures. And at the moment, if you include CPE, if you include cloud infrastructure, if you include telecoms networks, on the premise that 70%, the big number, 70% of all network traffic is currently video. So you can argue that that's sort of aligned with how much of the electricity is being used for those services. You come to the most amazing number, which is 54 nuclear power stations of energy are being used to underpin streaming, which is a sensationalist number. It's there to get the conversation going. but we formed Greening of Streaming as a sort of, at the moment, just a place to sign up if you're interested in sustainability and you're a participant in our part of the industry. And over the year, the conversation went from me and Tim talking about it to hearing it being reported by the public companies in their quarterly financial announcements and starting to become a much more central topic. And as we've come towards this year's Content Delivery Summit, we actually gave Greening of Streaming a chunk of time in the program, and we were really honoured to have the Director of Corporate Sustainability and his boss, who is the CTO and the guy who does all the global carrier commissioning for Akamai, join us for half an hour to talk about their response and some of their sustainability strategy and so on. But also we spoke to them kind of publicly about one of the things we want to kick off in the next few weeks now with Greening and Streaming, which is there isn't a common lexicon, there isn't a common set of measures, there isn't a common language by which we're actually able to measure our impact on changing these things. So we can talk about 54 nuclear power stations and 70% of network traffic, but really they're reasonably meaningless unless we can relate that to architectural decisions that we can make. You know, we just to sort of finish the wrap and see what the guests and where your head's at. Mark and I were talking, I think, Mark, you put me onto Earth resolution.
Earth definition, I think is
Earth definition, that's it, sorry. Which was an earthday.org initiative. And I think regardless of how well it was executed and so on, I think the sentiment is really valid. And the idea that, I know, Scott, you're dying to talk about things going to 8K, that the idea of endlessly increasing your cache requirements, endlessly increasing your power demands and so on, just to get this extra definition, when in fact minimum viable product and good enough, which is my world, is maybe considerably lower demand on resolution, then we have a responsibility as architects to understand what we're deploying and take responsibility for that, because we can't go burning a hole in the atmosphere for those extra pixels unless they really present value. So that's my starter for 10 on Greening of Streaming. Tim and I are going to try and host a Zoom, a bit like SMAF, with some of the key actors, but also inviting anyone else that wants to join the session to join, and we'll let people come forward and share thoughts. And we are going to sort of have a discussion about whether a members association that starts to draw up a best practices paper might be a great way for the industry to try to align some of its thinking, because really there's no point in competing on this. We either all win together or nobody wins. So as an issue, I'm quite excited. And I think the final point is, given how little innovation there is in price in our sector at the moment, given that we're beating each other silly over performance differences which really don't make a difference, I think that sustainability is going to be the most exciting area of innovation over the next decade in our sector, doing exactly what we're doing now, but doing it more energy efficiently.
And I'll add that Vinay, the CTO at Akamai, said that's actually the biggest challenge. He said, you can build a better server with better NIC cards and all that kind of thing, but innovating to the efficiency piece is a major challenge that they see. And I think all of us see. I mean, Mark, when you do remote production, if you have something that could last on a battery for 5 hours as opposed to 2.5 hours, that's better all around, because there's less environmental impact from that standpoint. So.
Agreed. I mean, in terms of what we can do on the production side, it's really a drop in the bucket, just because that's the start of a very large, tree-shaped graph. But I'm curious, at the end of this long research journey, Dom, what are you still kind of wading through it all, or were there 2 or 3, fundamental initiatives that you feel would make the most impact?
I definitely think that raising the key performance indicator of power as a primary architectural consideration, I'm calling it the 3 Ps at the moment, as a primary architectural consideration alongside price and performance. So as a techie for 25 years, I've been delivering solutions and technologies to people that are always either about being price competitive or about being performance competitive, and that's it. Mm-hmm. There's never been a requirement or a discussion about power competitive. That's just a last sort of afterthought about running costs, OPEX costs.
And do you feel like it's you feel like that's a near future addition to the equation, or a far future?
I think it's no. I think it's huge. I think that in the last 12 months, key indicator, and this will branch straight into Scott's world, particularly. Sorry, Liberty, I didn't want to cut across there, but this will branch into Scott's world particularly. You see Google making some big infrastructure announcements about introducing video-capable hardware units and graphics processing (FPGA) into the cloud fabric itself. 12 months ago, if you went to any of the clouds and said, we want access to this type of fabric, they'd go, no, we're not even getting Intel GPUs on our chipsets. It's something we can do in software because software is vanilla. 12 months later, and we're starting seeing entire regions being architected to offer FPGA offload, offer GPU offload, and even specialist warehouses like Google's video warehousing strategy, which are doing specialist graphics processing in DSP because of power efficiency, because at that scale, it's a key bottom line figure, if nothing else, but it's also socially responsible and good marketing to be efficient in those areas. So I think there's a long way to go, but there's a lot of innovation, and the hardware guys are suddenly interesting. They're no longer going, oh, look, my FPGA can do more exaflops per second. They're actually, talking about they can do the same as you can do, but they can do it for 4 watts instead of 400 watts.
Right. So it sounds to me, and my gut tells me that this really is an efficiency problem and not a problem of resetting the standard of figuring out what is good enough, what an MVP means in terms of what we're streaming, and that getting back to the whole Earth definition thing. I think that's a bit of a ham-handed way to go about it. I don't think we're going to social engineer anyone into going back to 720p as the top.
But it's very important to have the public pressure on the public companies.
Agreed.
But how Earth resolution, Earth definition, does raise the public awareness, which means that when the quarterlies come out, increasingly
it does, but it focuses the public attention the wrong way. I feel it's like do you really need 4K? Yes, we really need 4K. We need Netflix to stream in 4K for many reasons, but fundamentally because that's where the consumer electronics industry wants it to be, and eventually it'll be 8K 120, and there's no stopping that train. What we can do is make our ability to encode 8K 120 far more efficient than we're doing right now. And we need some sort of Energy Star type that doesn't exist, or does it exist? Does that exist in the UK?
Let me just say this, Mark, because I worked on a research project 9 years ago around set-top boxes, where at that point we were looking at, it was 12 nuclear power plants to power set-top boxes. Now Dom's saying, this 54 number. That was one of the pushes in the States, was the reason we went to say streaming boxes, or the little boxes for multiple rooms in your house off of one main set-top box, was because consumers said, we are willing, as long as you give us the same quality and the same speed of access, to do something that is more power efficient. So I think we as the techies come at it from the how do we deal with it at scale, but from a consumer standpoint and social impact standpoint, and I'd love to hear Liberty's take on this, is that there are drivers from the consumer side who will say, I'm willing to do X as long as I get the same quality and speed of access to content.
But there's also, and sorry to jump in here, Liberty, but if you're talking about set-top boxes, you're talking about a piece of gear that's in a consumer's home, and they're getting some sort of benefit in terms of their energy usage directly, right? It's not that they have to care about the environment to take that step. They're actually seeing some direct benefit. Whereas what we're talking about is infrastructural changes that don't impact the consumer directly, that the consumer really needs to kind of get on board to save the earth, so to speak. So I think in terms of trying to direct the message to the consumer toward things like, do we really need 4K, is a losing battle. I think we really need to be directing them towards we need to green this industry much like we greened every other industry. So my point,
it's worse than that. They're not just pushing towards 4K. you're also pushing towards screen real estate that is getting towards the size of a wall. That's not a very power efficient thing either. Yeah, there will be a push to energy star these screens. Part of the reason why I argue that you want to do 8K, and I really do want to hear what Liberty wants to say here, because I see the virtual hand up there. These screens are huge. They absorb a lot of power, and the consumer wants content on them. So the idea that we're going to down-res video down to a lower resolution isn't the solution. We need to come up with better ways to do it. But I want to defer to Liberty because she's been waiting quite a while to have
do it.
Oh no, I was
Liberty.
actually just jumping in. Thank you for the toss. See, that's the Canadian A. That just essentially what both Tim and Mark saying, okay, well, the consumer wants this, the bigger, the better, the baddest, and it coming down to, well, then like I'm going to say more of like almost a marketing spin, because as we've seen with Apple at their last announcement, and they're talking about their carbon print and the footprint and what they're doing, that makes you, oh yeah, so you want to do more with their products. Like it's just going to have to be coming both from the tech side of, okay, how are we going to create these solutions, but then the marketing play and that social messaging is really going to be what makes it come together for us to see that impact, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but one of the things I'm finding interesting in this conversation is the people who, so I'm going to go back in my history a little bit. I'm not really at the place where I can talk about what the cloud providers are doing. I'm not savvy enough at this time to talk about that. I can talk about what I did in the past. And I know the guys who are doing last mile delivery in the US, and that's your cable companies, that's your Comcast, your Charters, your AT&Ts. They really care about the power because that's a huge cost to them. And they want to green up. Yes, it looks great on the balance sheet, but it also looks good to the consumer. It's a great spin out to the consumer, Liberty. And I think this is a little bit of that confidence back to the consumer who is really concerned about the greening of America right now. About, hey, there is a social conscience going out right now that they really care. But the CFO also is looking at this going, how much money did I spend on power?
So true.
I can't disclose, because I can't remember how many different pop sites I ran. But the power bill was ridiculous. And every month it was like, well, how do we reduce this? And we were always pushing on our vendors on the chipset side and on the server side. And then eventually that push through to our cloud vendor side to say, look, how are you reducing this cost? The TCO of this included, what was our power bill? And we were always asking that question. How much power was involved in this? Can you reduce that power bill so we spent less money? Yes, it looked great in public relations to say, look, we're being more green, but it also saved us money. And we talked a minute ago about all these little boxes we have all over the home. So we're a family of 4. Unfortunately, we have 5 TVs. I can't explain why we need 5 TVs in the house, but we have. And we have, I think the last time I counted, we have 17 streaming boxes in the house. We have more streaming boxes than we can count here. These things are not terribly efficient. They're not terribly well made. They're disposable. I think, Dom, the question we also need to start asking ourselves are, why are we all buying these little disposable boxes that are essentially landfill kit? We want to talk about the greening of streaming. We really need to stop and look at ourselves as consumers about why are we buying all these little disposable boxes that for $85 that we're throwing away every couple of years.
Right.
I will freely admit, I've gone back to my cable provider because my local cable provider has given me a box and I can put all the apps on it. And I can use that box to use all my apps on 3 of my TVs. I'm starting to get rid of all these other small boxes. It makes my connectivity easier to my TV. My controls are easier. But frankly, I looked at it from, I have less plugs. I have less landfill.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny to say, but sorry, Liberty, go ahead, and then I want to come back.
Just a small part to follow up on Scott. Well, doesn't that go back to the education factor, like with what Dom is doing, just this whole educating on actually putting numbers to quantify it so that we can have the right messaging, so that we can communicate why we don't need so many boxes.
Right. Well, and so I wanted to throw something in there, Scott, because you mentioned sort of the landfill and e-waste, and this was a nice part of the conversation Dom and I had with the 2 gentlemen from Akamai. We were talking about end of life, and what I've focused on here for the last year and a half now is 501c3 charity that builds robust systems to send to NGOs and emerging economies, whether it's Africa, India, other places that I've worked. And one of the things that Akamai was saying is we don't know what to do with our servers when we're done with this. We don't really want to see them go into the landfill. So a big part of what we're trying to figure out from our side is the repurposing of that technology that we consider throwaway here in the first world, and working to move some of that technology over into emerging economies where they don't have access to it, being able to do it where rather than dropping something in a landfill here, we repurpose that for a better use somewhere else. And what's interesting about that is we know we're going to run into a situation where we'll have, 15 laptops come in and we may only be able to get 3 or 4 workable laptops out of that. Then the conversation becomes, what do you do with the aluminum? What do you do with the frame? Those kinds of things. But that's a whole lot better than hey, we're going to toss this stuff in a landfill and not worry about the toxic leach that comes off of, an entire computing system.
And let's not ignore the fact that a lot of this e-waste is a function of some decisions that are being made at the top level at some of these electronics manufacturers. I'm looking at Apple. I bought an Apple TV 4K because I wanted to consume some of the content that was coming off of some of the services that I could not consume with my older Apple TV. So that older Apple TV is, I think, sitting in a box somewhere in my house, but it'll go into a landfill at some point because it's obsolete at this point to me. That's a decision that Apple made to not make their unit reverse compatible with older content, or forward compatible with newer content, to revise the software on the older devices to consume the new content because they wanted to sell a new box, period. So, and they'll talk all day about how green their operation is, but no one's, addressing that factor. And I think it's a more important factor to consider than the decisions that are made with regard to infrastructure, because I think, to Scott's point, the infrastructure choices are kind of made for these companies. It's the unholy union of the CTO and CFO getting together to figure out how they drop their bottom line, and that they'll make those decisions regardless of whether it's green. They just want a lower power bill. So I think that'll happen. I think the thing that we can move the needle on is whether or not corporations are taking an eco-minded approach to their manufacturing decisions.
I don't want to make the CTO and the CFO completely evil.
No. It's the union of the two that's evil.
There can be some actual merit in their decision process. I think they can have green visions in mind, and that's great. But let's not forget, they save money. It's okay. I live in corporate America. It's great for the shareholder if they save some money, and it looks good on the balance sheet, and it looks good to the shareholders if we get green. It's a winning proposition.
But there's
no bad in that.
This is the beauty of This is the beauty of the ESG movement, the environmental social governance piece, where it says, just like Dom's saying, let's put power as one of the 3 Ps. Ultimately, what corporate, whether it's a trend or whether it's an anomaly that's just happening for a brief period of time, what we're seeing is corporations having to pay attention to that as part of their reporting. And therefore, it does force some of those decisions. But Mark, your point's really well taken, that planned obsolescence is a hallmark of the consumer electronics industry. The reason we all have cheaper 4K TVs or cheaper 1080p TVs is because when there was the push to do 3D TV, which flopped dramatically, it pushed the price down of standard 1080p's. Obviously, as we've tried to go to 8K, it's going to push the price of 4Ks down. But you're right, it's a planned obsolescence hallmark of that industry that will continue because they need to sell more gear.
But they didn't do a terrible job, though. I mean, let's be honest. When they made the move to flat panels, we got rid of CRTs. CRTs were very power hungry, So moving to flat panels, not entirely terrible. Unfortunately, there's a lot of flat panels sitting in people's rooms right now that are just not in use anymore. I can tell you, I've been at a friend's place and he's got several old computer monitors just sitting off in the corner, not doing anything. People just don't know what to do with them now.
Well, and that's the thing is, as we go through with Help Me Stream, and as we start to collect that stuff to build systems, everybody I talk to has 20, between old smartphones, tablets, computers, and monitors. They have a bunch of this stuff sitting there that they don't know what to do with. And on one hand, we're not allowed to throw it away, but on the other hand, we don't want it cluttering up our space, especially when we've been captive for the last year and a half. So,
Tim, I'm going to cut across. We got a couple of comments in from Jeff. From Rude is making a point which I think segues nicely from what we were just saying, which is it would help if smart TV ecosystems would be more open and fast enough so that we can use their onboard hardware instead of having to buy multiple boxes. That shouldn't have to be, that shouldn't be necessary. And I certainly agree with that. I think, Chromecasting, Apple TV, AirPlay, or whatever it's called. I think that these should be the smart set-top boxes, because you take them with you and it's just one thing being charged. That's a good sort of first step. You don't need another set-top box so that you don't have to reach for your phone. It's just there's one computer there already. And another good point, which probably will branch us out into other areas, from Jeff, is what I don't understand about the green discussion is how much green savings comes from people staying at home, using online means to work, I think, and watching online instead of driving to offices and so on. And I think that's one of those interesting ones. When I first started looking at this, a great example that was going around sort of before streaming was center stage was lots of people saying, don't print your emails because it's cutting down trees. It's a very direct association between paper and trees, but actually keeping an email in deep storage on a Google Drive for 20 years until you next open it again is burning probably several trees a day. And actually, if you just printed it out and put it in a filing box under your desk, it wouldn't have burnt any carbon to store it there, apart from that one piece of paper. So there are displacements with power that aren't immediately apparent. There's lots of unintended consequences of making the wrong power savings by moving things online, moving things offline. And I think the assumption is the internet is harmless. It doesn't use any energy. It's free. It doesn't consume trees. But actually, instead of writing on paper, we're burning trees to power it. And
and I think that's while I take issue with your several trees a day calculation, I think that's the
no, I'm a sensationalist at mode at the moment.
I think that is the fundamental message, is that the internet isn't free. That's what we need to evangelize to consumers within our industry and within the consumer electronics industry and the .com industry as a whole, that it's not free. There is an impact. There is a cost that you're footing, certainly, but so is the earth.
Now, what at this point, Mark, we've done half of SMAFT today on greening of streaming. What I do want to say is, if this topic in particular interests you, please go to greeningofstreaming.org and add your name to basically the mailing list at the moment. And as we get the event together, we're going to invite everybody to come and take part and give everybody as much airtime as we can to hear what people think. I'm naive to the industry. I'm a CDN tech. This is all new to me, and I'm learning by the day. And greening of streaming is about trying to find a common language to speak to everyone about it and bring the issue to the forefront of people's minds. And if you've got something to share, please come and do that.
That was a really, really smooth plug. That was nicely done. That was really nicely done.
Can I plug Dom for something on that? So Dom had this conversation with me in a pub right before COVID kicked in, and he convinced me enough that I don't use electronic storage of my notes anymore. I've gone back old school, ruled notebook. Thanks, Dom. Man. Yeah.
So I've got good deep storage.
I've got a question for Liberty, because we talked about this sort of idea of 70% of the internet is video. So Liberty, you work in a marketing agency or helping to advocate for particular causes, etc. In the old days, it was we did something in print, whether it was in a magazine or on a billboard or a mailer that you sent out to people, and that was somewhat impactful. Video obviously is quite a bit more impactful, but it also takes a lot more time to produce a video than it does to produce a print ad. What do you see for your customers that they feel video is sort of the marketing tool as opposed to the traditional sort of print or a website banner ad or something like that?
Well, I can say that especially in the last year of just how people have been able to communicate, they looked at the cost savings of, okay, there was a lot of crisis communication. So we were called out for nonprofits and they needed to present something to their audience to let them know that we're doing donations, or here's how you can still get food and access to those things. So it's shifted dramatically because of COVID. So in answering that, it was a harder sell before, because to sell that you should do virtual and doing live stream, and yes, the people who can't attend your event still want to, gain access to it. But now it's shifted. So it doesn't completely answer that, but it's an easier sell now because they see that, well, what can video do that complex ideas? That's typically if you've got a product, if you've got some technology that you're showing. That's why Apple, you've seen how succinct Apple has become. And I feel like I've been plugging Apple in the couple times that I've been speaking. I'm sorry, Scott, that's not intentional, but just in how that they've been doing their keynotes. Like, to go back to the greening of streaming, look at how that has changed. I don't really foresee Apple going back as large as that. Like, we're going to see that video because of the amount of information that they can communicate. So yes, it takes time, but I believe that people are seeing the value in them and then the way in video and how they can communicate with others.
And it's interesting you mentioned the large events that Apple used to do, especially when Steve Jobs did the announcement of the iPhone. I personally have been working at an orphanage in Mexico, and then flew in for his keynote of that phone. And for me, there was this real third world, first world disconnect when he did the presentation. But one of the things that Akamai said was when he did that presentation, it took them like 300 machines to actually do all the streaming of that live for people. Today, their CTO said they could do that all on a single machine. So not only is the impact of what he did impressive, but also the fact that if we can do that more efficiently, it becomes even more impressive. How much of what you do for your customers is sort of pre-recorded content that is pushed out versus live events?
Yeah, pre-recorded has definitely, I think a good way to describe it is how much risk is involved. So when you have a client that is in robotics and they know the image that they're presenting, that they need to pre-record it. And then, yes, it will be streamed live, but they're looking at the fact that what happens if the machine doesn't or whatever. So mitigating some of those risk factors, that's when, doing it pre-recorded and streaming it live. Those people who do go ahead and stream live are the ones who understand how much rehearsal it takes so that it can. But just based on the nature of what the content is, those that have someone who's vivacious and can really engage, Q&A, kind of like this format that we're doing here, where you're engaging with the audience, reading comments, that's where the live aspect works really well.
Okay. Yeah, and it's funny, again, thinking back to all of the Steve Jobs keynotes I went to, he always had 3 minutes.
Uh-oh.
Tim's
We've
gone.
lost him. It's
Can
convenient.
we finish this question for him?
That's it.
We intuit Tim's call.
Okay, I've got a standing question anyway, which I think segues in. But have you guys found over the last year that the general public's understanding of what streaming is has transformed immensely? I mean, I think back 20 years ago and trying to explain to my parents what I do for a living. And I try to, they probably tell me more about what I do for a living now than I can tell them, to be honest. It's just transformed the public perception of streaming and the utilization of the technology.
Yeah,
I think that.
Yeah, go ahead,
sorry,
Mark.
Liberty, go ahead. I was just going to agree with you that it, the pandemic. I mean, one of the many effects that it's had, it's kind of redefined when live is necessary. Everything was live before, and then all of a sudden people had to think critically about, the message they were trying to convey and how they were trying to convey it, and what was most effective and most efficient, and how you could maximize interactivity now that we have this captive audience, right? Like, it actually matters now. So what are we doing, and how are we doing it, and how can we do it most effectively? And I think a lot of people realized oh, this doesn't need to be live. Like even in these virtual concerts that everyone was having back in like April and May and June of last year, and they've kind of filtered through and metamorphosized over time. A lot of them were pre-recorded. A lot of the stuff that we were doing with big acts was either pre-recorded content with a live host, or the whole thing was pre-recorded. Shh, don't tell anybody. Like look at the Apple keynote events that have happened, recently, these amazing, very high concept shows that they've been doing with Tim and, many C-level and VP level executives at Apple at various locations around the campus, and, cool drone shots and all this stuff. It's far more compelling than what they were doing, on a stage in a theater, period. Yeah. And I don't think they're ever going to go back to the way it was before. So anyway, just want to interject that.
Tim Cook's style of delivery is different than Steve Jobs' style. So yeah, if you can't replace the showman, do what they did with the more recent ones, like you said, where they do all those pre-recorded things around campus.
I don't know. I think the difference between Steve and Tim is negligible. Like, Steve was a little bit more, compelling off the bat, but the message is still the same, and it's not necessary to deliver that message live. If you're going to have the same, media live blogging your event, whether it's live or not, then it doesn't matter if it's live or not.
Fair point. And
Can I turn Dom's question around? Dom, you asked, has the public's perception of streaming changed?
I did, yeah.
No, it hasn't. Most people just want to come home and watch TV. I don't think it's changed at all. I think most people just want to come home and watch TV. Are they consuming more content on more devices? Yeah. But, there happens to be a bar just right out my back door here, and it's been open for the last little while here, and people generally in the neighborhood know what I do, and I talk to people what they do, what they've watched, and that sort of thing. The comment is, what have you been doing? I've watched a lot of TV. Nobody said I've streamed a lot more Netflix, or I've downloaded a lot more content, or I've engaged more with Disney Plus, or
yeah.
I've just watched a lot more TV.
What about people who suddenly? There was a graph. A traffic graph, which was very interesting, spanning back the last 18 months. And there was a period on the sort of global network traffic that Zoom was about 10-15% higher traffic than even Netflix, which was considerably higher. And I wonder whether the public perception of streaming has an immediacy, has an association with video conferencing in a way that when you ask people if they're streaming or they're using streaming, or they might even mean they're using tools like Zoom to communicate rather than watching TV, which I think is a very valid point, Scott. I think
it's the argument I've been making for years, is that no one really cares what the medium is. They just care that they get video on their screen. That's it. Exactly. And 15 years ago, we were talking about, I would identify as someone who was in the streaming media industry, right? Because it was vastly different than traditional media, right? The convergence happened a long time ago, and now streaming media is media, period. So whether you're talking about real-time, Zoom streaming, or live streaming events like the type of things that my company does, or on-demand streaming like Netflix and Hulu, it's all media.
Sublimated.
Exactly. And I feel like there's a certain relevance to calling something like streamingmedia.com or Streaming Media Advanced Forum. It specifies, that we're talking about the streaming side of media delivery, but at some point, this is just going to be a talk about media.
Yeah, my cable box, which has a whole bunch of apps on it, my kids don't go, I'm going to watch cable now, or I'm going to start streaming something. I'm just going to go watch some TV now.
Yeah.
Except gamers, throwing them in esports, that they would have they're gaming, but then just the streaming. But valid point.
No, that's what I'm getting at.
The interactivity. I think the interactivity is maybe the coming way. The association of streaming is now interactive video media rather than one-to-many video media, which is what you Mark and Scott were talking about, which is watching TV and the webcast experience where it's just produced. But the interactivity, I think gaming, I think teaching online, those types of things might be becoming what the general public perceive to be streaming when you talk about streaming.
Right, where there's community, right? So when you're on Zoom, there's
something
community,
two-way,
right.
Yeah, I think my overall point is that, us streaming media old folks have this tendency to talk in terms of, streaming media versus traditional media. The conversation, no one cares about that conversation anymore. The conversation should be the types of content, not the types of media. It should, whether it's on-demand content or live content or interactive content. Those are my three buckets, basically.
Like I tell people, I'm a broadcast engineer at a cloud company. I'm not doing cable or satellite anymore. I'm doing video.
Right.
It just happens to be now I'm working on content production versus streaming and distribution. There's a little bit of that, but it's mostly about content. Yes. Nobody cares whether or not I'm going to put it out on a cable box or to a Roku, to a smart TV, or to a satellite receiver. It's just media.
So, Mark, your company does, live movie premieres. You do Esports, you do a bunch of different things like that. Scott made a comment, gaming dwarfs video. How do you bucketize the stuff you're doing for esports versus the other kinds of live event productions that you do?
Well, I think to Liberty's point, it's really not about whether it's esports, because that's a pretty fraught, title. That's a pretty fraught name. You've got esports. The type of stuff that we do is like any other sports and entertainment, property. We're broadcasting an event, right? But then there's the much larger, segment of the esports market, which is individual casters playing a game or talking about someone else playing a game on Twitch. Like, that's way bigger than the audiences, overall than the audiences that we get for even the biggest events. So, I think it's really a matter of, the type of, whether it's interactive or not, live or not. Those are the two questions that you should be asking. Not whether it's esports or a live concert, because the two are very similar in certain respects, and then you've got the interactive part. I think that's the turning point of how we talk about streaming media. It is at hand at this point, and it's whether the content is interactive or not is the important thing. And I think the pandemic has kind of shown a light on that. I think people are actually, talking about that in terms of media now and including that in the conversation.
Well, it makes me happy, having come from video conferencing into streaming, to see that consumers have widely embraced interactive or video conferencing as part of their day-to-day life as well. One comment on Twitch, because you mentioned Twitch. Maybe a year ago, there had been a conversation where Twitch was trying to keep from having to pull the audio streams down of their gamers who were listening to content in the background that they weren't licensed for. And, they went through a whole DMCA period. And then they said, hey, we're going to try to license it so that we can, make sure that people's audio streams don't get pulled down. I read just this last week that there's another 1,000 DMCA requests that have come through, and they're going to start killing off those streams again. Do we know if Twitch was unable to get that licensing model together, or are they just succumbing to what everybody else has succumbed to, which is DMCAs come in, we just take them down, no questions asked?
It's a 24-hour notice. So. When you get a DMC takedown, you get a 24-hour notice to explain your content or prove that you've got the rights to use it or whatever. If you write them a letter back, there's no budget to do anything about it, so you can stay on air. It's a real interesting legal conundrum.
And I find it fascinating that Twitch was trying to get out ahead of it and say, hey, rather than taking down, a third of our streams for people who are streaming on Twitch, let's figure out a way to monetize this so that it's not illegal, so to speak. But it seems like that conversation died about a year ago.
By my estimation, there's probably certainly less than 1,000. I would imagine there's possibly less than 300 legally licensed, properly licensed music hosts online. Most of the others are falling back on the DMCA and passing liabilities around to keep the platform on air but take the artists down. Or it's amazing that I was asked this afternoon by a group of people, how are these people using Restream to go out to 17 platforms and none of them are getting taken down, and they're DJing? What's going on, and how are they getting licensed to do it? And they aren't. They frankly aren't. It's just such a short-lived thing that there's no time to issue a takedown and have the live stream, the DJ set taken down. When they pass the takedown notices down, sometimes the artists or publishers are writing back saying, it's my music, prove it's not, which then the platform goes, okay, I'll forward that back to the RIAA, who go, well, we don't have a desk to deal with that, rip it up. And it's the buck is gradually being passed beyond the notice and takedown. I was quite closely involved with the development of notice and takedown over here in the UK. And it was all about who's going to pay for messaging all these pirates. That's going to have an overhead. So who's going to pay for it and handle it? And as soon as the pirates go back saying, I'm not pirating, certainly no one's going to take on the budget to fight that legal battle.
Well,
it's a really interesting conundrum.
And I asked that because I did a session 2 weeks ago with one of the guys from Blizzard who handles all their media delivery, and he basically said he said two things. We push it out to Twitch, we push it out to YouTube, so their systems have algorithms that sort of handle that. But he said on the other hand, we look for those people who are doing retrans of Blizzard content, especially things like BlizzCon. If we find somebody's got a really good size audience on it, rather than doing a takedown, we go have a conversation with them about how to do revenue share. And I said, boy, that's a really refreshing conversation to hear, as opposed to we're going to squash it, and we're going to squash it as hard as we possibly can. So,
well, the right societies have really had their comeuppance over the pandemic, because they just simply aren't paying out enough royalty to keep any musicians alive. And yet they are the preventative the problem with online platforms providing music. So musicians have not been able to make a living online because of the licensing systems, which are supposed to be making them a living. And it's the licensing people's problem to fight that battle, because as we all know, the tech can help the musicians get it out there.
I didn't want to take us on a tangent, but that just sort of fascinated me when Mark mentioned Twitch. I remembered the conversation. So, Dom,
I think to answer your question, if I can just throw it in there, I think the way that those work is that it's cyclical. They reached you reach a détente. There's no takedown notices for a while, and then there are a whole bunch, and there are none, and there are a whole bunch. It's when someone wants to pay attention to Twitch, they pay attention to Twitch. Twitch launched the soundtrack thing back in September, which has seen kind of limited adoption among the larger Twitch streamers, and had it been adopted, that would have solved part of the problem. But I think the bigger problem, to Dom's point, is if you've got a 2-hour long stream, there's really no opportunity for anyone to take it down. But if I'm a caster and I'm doing, constant content for, on a 12 or 24 hour a day basis, that's a huge target for a DMCA takedown. So I think, Twitch, dealt with it the best way they could with the soundtrack platform. And I think if they evangelize a little bit more, it's really cool. I don't know if you've checked it out, but people will use it more. But I think people also want to have, complete creative control over what they're putting out on Twitch, and they're willing to risk the takedown to do it. So until that changes,
they just game better if they have their own, the music that they're used to listening to while they game. Ultimately, that to me seems to be one of the parts of it.
Liberty, Liberty, how do you deal with using music in sort of content that you're helping your clients put together?
We have producers. we do our best. There's some licensing. Why does the name slip me? There's some sites that we'll go to just depending on what it is. But more times than not, when we know what the client needs it for, it's like, oh yeah, no, we talk to our producers and get them, music producers, I should say.
Yeah, it's a minefield. It's especially as you start to want to do non-geographically restricted content. it becomes a bomb. It was, again, I did an article for Streaming Media magazine at the beginning of the year and went deep into the music licensing space. And there was a very interesting lawyer I met, Tom, who had done the licensing for Beatport, Last.fm, Spotify, all Mixcloud, all the major. He said 160 you've heard of and 500 you haven't. But it does feel to me that there's surprisingly few people who are licensed, and an amazing number of music, amazing amount of music you can hear online, which I can't quite get my head around how they can sustainably build an audience without getting taken down. But
yeah, and when you look at even just tagging on there of when COVID hit and musicians and all the arts folks who were out of work, then yeah, there's an opportunity if we really want to say, let's change the industry to work with artists, upcoming artists. And I think we're going to see that more and more because they recognize now, oh, so I need to have multiple avenues, not just in person.
Interestingly, there's a new license being introduced by the PRS over here, and if you pay for the license over here, they seem to be giving you global distribution agreements for the first time to do paywalled music gigs. They call it the online live music concert ticket, and they are charging a sort of minimum floor fee of about £22. And then they charge something like, and this is all off the top of my head, something like 10% of ticket revenue as your royalty. And for the first time in 25 years being passionate about music streaming online, it is now possible to go and do a paid for gig and have your rights legally paid for. And it's confusing because you can't, it's tied to the promoter. So how it can be policed, I have no idea. It's done on more or less on good faith. So there's no way they could be policing whether you're using Zoom or YouTube Live or whatever. As long as there's a paywall in place, it's about paid for concerts. But if you go through the process and somebody comes and says you shouldn't be doing that, then you can at least hold up a piece of paper and say, yes, I can. So you can promote it and sell tickets. So I think there's some change coming. I think the pandemic was good for that. But
yeah.
Yes, we are done in 4 minutes, Scott, but it's 3 now, so because I've been waffling. Listen, Scott, Liberty, what are you guys up to over the next few weeks and next month or two? What's happening in your sort of eventing world, in your production world, in your work world?
Starting to plan travel. Getting ready to travel to Europe in February. So starting to plan travel to various football venues to see people getting ready to do shoots. The last shoot I was at was with some of my friends from a very large British company that was shooting in 120 hertz at 8K in HDR. I'm hoping to see more of that. Yes, I really do think that's where we're going. Oh, and it was full frame rate. It wasn't fractional. That's for some of my friends in the US. There's a lot more of that. I'm actually going to spend a lot of time with different vendors looking at where do we go from here. From my point of view, HDR is done. We're going to do HDR. You just choose your flavor. It's now, how do we move to 8K? How do we get that out there? How do we get it to the consumer? The screens are ready. The camera lenses are pretty much ready. Production is getting there. We have work to do in some areas, but that's where I want to go off and work with vendors. How do we get it moved around? That sort of thing. That's my world for the next couple of years.
You've got to get me off 720p. Go ahead, Liberty.
Yeah, and likewise, just with Scott on that tail end of the hybrids. Hybrids are not going anywhere. Just basically looking at, okay, doing more cloud production. I got to look into Azure. More cloud production, and then just helping our clients look towards the future. So lots of trend spotting and forecasting. Interesting period of change. Mark, how about you? What have you got
just getting back to more traditional forms of production and having everything not be totally virtual. Looking forward to that. I don't travel as much as I used to, but it'll be nice to be, boots on the ground rather than boots in my office.
Back to expense accounts. Accounts.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Excellent. And Tim, how about you?
I was going to say 100% deductible business as well. Things we get, even though we can't do business meals. Let's see, Dom. So on a practical level, trying to figure out what to do with all the plexiglass that is being donated to us for Help Me Stream for building our systems, because it seems like everybody here is taking down their plexiglass shields and not knowing what to do with it, they're donating it to us. But no, actually looking forward to, I've got 2 survey reports coming out, one around open exchange with enterprise video, and a second one with Toolix around OTT, and I'll be finishing the writing of those reports here over the next couple of weeks.
Cool. Well, listen, a massive thank you to Scott. You'll have to say something to come on camera.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, wrong person. All right, I'll have to go to hit the spotlight button then. Hold on a sec. There you go. There's Scott. Give us a wave and a smile.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. Brilliant. Excellent. Thanks so much for coming. And Liberty, thank you too. It's been great to have you. Always good to have reps from the women streaming media on as well. So do keep shouting if you want to get on. We're always interested in building our guest roster and so on. And Mark, where are you? Let's find you. You can get back to your sideways profile and your early morning of taming the twins and doing your live web. Are you taking the twins to any Marvel shows?
Well, we do have a Marvel show coming up. When you mentioned red carpets, there has not been a return to red carpets yet. Strangely enough, I'm told because the celebrities aren't risking it yet.
Right. Your kids are going to be old enough to appreciate that Dad can take.
It could be. By the time we get back to red carpets, they'll be 8 or 9 years old, and they'll love it. Who knows? We'll see what happens.
Perfect.
Hoping sooner than that.
Tim, brilliant. I hope you feel a bit better. I know you've had a rough day, but I hope that clears up and you feel better. And if you can't think of anything to do with the plexiglass, build a box, put yourself in it, keep yourself safe from germs. So, and then
except for the germs that actually were on the plexiglass when they were donated. Yeah, that's the whole.
Yeah, I would sterilize them before you do anything with them. Right, brilliant. Well, that's enough. You don't need any more waffle from me. And keep your eyes out on Greening and Streaming because we might be doing our first event soon. That'd be good to see you there. Have fun.